I think we have some guests here attending, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Pam Meissner. I'm with Cathedral Capital, and I have today with me an impressive woman. She is not only an impressive woman, she's an impressive leader, she's an impressive attorney. She is someone I admire as a mom. She practices law in Fort Worth, Texas. And her specialty is human resources, labor and employment, which she's been doing as a managing partner of Pham Harrison for several years. And I think I told you when we first started working together, Caroline, that I love labor and employment attorneys because they have the best stories. So I think you still owe me a few good stories, but maybe you can enlighten our audience a little bit about, our relationship and how you heard about Cathedral Capital and how you got recruited to come on this webinar today.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to be here and talk to everybody about the PPP and the employment issues that a lot of my clients are having. Not specific issues that my specific clients are having, but generally the types of things I keep hearing constantly from my clients. I came to Cathedral Capital after running my own firm with some partners for a couple of years. And as it turns out, we are very good at being lawyers and not so good at the financial aspect of the business. We did okay with it, but there are just certain inefficiencies, shall we say, that lawyers don't really understand because that's not what we do. We're not the financial people, and most of us don't think like a CFO thinks. And so I heard Brooke speak at a Women's Bar Association luncheon, and the things that she was saying really resonated with me. And I would say that we were getting a C+ to a B as a grade on how we were handling our finances, and the things that she talked about doing to help get us to that A level really seemed to make a lot of sense. So we sat down with Brooke, my partner, Lou Pham, and I, and it seemed to make sense to us to hire Cathedral Capital to come on as a fractional CFO. And then she introduced us to you, Pam, and you work with us now to help us do those things that we're not great at and help us plan strategically and look at things from the smart financial mode as opposed to the lawyer, I'm running a business, I don't have time to think about this, so I'm just going to do what feels right at this second. So it's made a really big difference, and it's really helped us be in a much stronger position than we would have been had this current crisis happened to us a year ago.
Right. And so I think it was on one of those calls that we started discussing, and tons of clients were asking you questions about the COVID-19 related financing. We were asking you questions for your firm. And then we were both coming at it from a different perspective. And so I think that's how the idea of this webinar was born. We went through that first wave of applying for the PPP and how do you calculate employees and, what is payroll, what is not payroll. And, we bantered that around a little bit. And then everybody got their PPPs. A lot of people got their PPPs in the first round.
Right.
And then we had the second round. But now we're coming at the whole benefit of the PPP obviously is forgiveness.
Right.
And so we wanted to take this time and go through what are some of the elements. And for those of you who are listening on the webinar or on Facebook, feel free to ask us questions as we go through this. We're just trying to anticipate your questions. But the things that we're hearing about now as people are getting into the heart of the consumption of the PPP, and they're very motivated to go and get forgiveness. They're struggling with a lot of things because PPP wasn't there when COVID hit and we had to close our doors. And so people laid off people People reduced people's salaries. You know, all the normal things we would do when a business hits a tragic moment, like we all did when we had to close, to level the curve out a little bit. So just to go through a few of the assumptions of forgiveness, but to put it in the context that these loans are through banks. While the SBA stands behind them, the loan was granted by the bank and the SBA backed that loan up, right? So they had to have approval that the SBA would underwrite it so that the SBA would guarantee it before they gave it. And so much like you had to go to your local bank, right? And we heard lots of differences between local banks and big banks and credit unions and online banks. Whoever gave you that PPP money is the one who's going to grant you forgiveness. And what we saw at Cathedral Capital as we went through this with many, many clients is, you know, all over the US and all different demographics of banks, a wide variety of interpretations of the law. And so I think we're going to see that as we go through forgiveness. So we're going to kind of talk to you about, you know, how we see forgiveness and the intent of the law. But no, I think it's important for everybody to go back to their banker and say, what do you need to see from me for forgiveness? So the intent was that you spend 75% of the money on payroll, and the other 25 can either be spent on payroll or on rent, mortgage interest, utilities, for obligations that started before February 15th.
Pam, can I ask you a question about that? Because one of the questions that I've been getting a lot recently is people asking about, I think there's a misunderstanding out there about whether you can spend more than 75% of your PPP funds on payroll and still be forgiven. In fact, I've gotten that question twice in the last week. And is there some difference if you are a sole proprietor or 1099 versus if you're a company?
Yeah, so we haven't dealt with a lot of the 1099 people. But again, I'm going to say go back to your bank. I think the spirit of the law, the whole way we calculated PPP was on payroll. So I haven't seen anything that puts a cap on how much you can put on payroll, but they want you to put at least 75% of it on payroll because that's the spirit of, you know, the Paycheck Protection Act, right? They want to keep people at the employers that they were at before this whole thing started.
So if you were, for example, thinking about hiring somebody and you maybe didn't have the funds to do it before, and now because you have PPP funds, you think you could hire someone, it's okay to bring somebody else on payroll, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the spirit of the law is that you want to go back to those employees, but I know a lot of people, and that's, I think, why we're getting into the calculation of FTEs, because they're not going to say, okay, was Sally on the payroll before COVID? Is she still on the payroll after COVID? They're not doing it. They're doing it in terms of dollars and in terms of the number of FTEs. I've also heard it on the head count. And I think there's great confusion there amongst borrowers on how you calculate not only the magnitude in terms of dollars, but how many bodies are in your business.
And that's something, right, that we don't have full clarity on yet, correct?
No, we don't, because when we read the law, we hear a new date, and we have all these favorite dates in our minds now, of June 30th, 2020. And so they say if you restore your payroll by that time, or your head count by that time, or your FTEs by that time, that you're okay. But a lot of people's PPP money 8-week period expires before June 30th. And so we don't know, right? You know, if you hire somebody on the last day and your bank says you give me head count, you're fine. But if your bank says give me full-time equivalents, and you hired them on the last day, then your PPP is going to be reduced. So chicken and an egg, you get the PPP money, and then you have to go through and calculate what you estimate your forgiveness is going to be. And so not only is it on the nature of the expenses that you're incurring, but it's also on these full-time equivalents. And this is where it really gets more in your neck of the woods than mine, because I've heard tons of different calculations on how you can calculate that. Maybe you can enlighten us on some of the questions that you've had and some of the research you've done.
So we literally don't know what FTEs means right now under this statute, under the CARES Act. Our best guess is that you'd look at the Affordable Care Act to determine how to calculate FTEs, because that's the other statute. As far as I know, it's the only other statute. Somebody could correct me, but I think it's the only other statute that has that terminology in it, FTEs. And so you would look at that statute to get the calculation, which I do not have memorized. But basically you would add up the hours of your part-time employees, and every time you get to the full-time equivalent, which then you'd have one employee. But the question, of course, arises because full-time under the Affordable Care Act is 30 hours. And so are they going to consider, everything I've seen is that 40 hours is full-time under the CARES Act and PPP. So as a lawyer, as a lawyer who specializes in employment law, I hate to say I don't know the answer to something, but I've had to say that a lot with the PPP, because we literally don't know the answer to this, because the SBA hasn't put out these regulations yet on how forgiveness is going to be calculated.
Right, and I've heard all those assumptions, and so I've been telling all my clients, well, what does your bank say, right? And when we ask that, they're like, well, the SBA hasn't told us yet. I'm like, okay, well, then we've got to dig in and come up with something that we think is defensible or that we can support when it comes time to be, judged with hindsight. So, but I think you told me one of the most helpful things is whatever I had to produce to get the PPP is what they're going to ask me to produce to get forgiveness.
Yeah, and so we got a PPP loan. We got our stuff together and worked with our local bank, and were fortunate enough timing-wise to get it in the first round. And when I had the conversation with my banker, when he told me that we were approved, he said, we don't know yet what forgiveness is going to look like, but we are all thinking here at the bank that it's going to be very similar to what you did to get approved in the first place. So he said, we're probably going to have you give us payroll reports, your 941s, which are the documents that your payroll company or you would file quarterly for taxes, for payroll taxes. Mm-hmm. And then your, if you're paying for health insurance, your health insurance invoices and proof that you paid it. And then if you're paying retirement, 401k, IRA, something like that, you'd want to show proof that you paid that. And then, if you're paying a lease, proof that you paid your lease payment. So it doesn't sound like it's going to be that onerous. My banker anticipated it to be not any more onerous than the application in the first place.
And those ran the whole gamut, let me tell you, because I think I helped support dozens of clients calculating that. And I'm like, okay, let's try this. So in terms of forgiveness, the one thing that maybe wasn't there in the application process is bonuses.
Yes, I've gotten a lot of questions about whether bonuses can be paid out under the PPP and forgiven, right? So, the statute is just not clear on that, and we don't have the guidance yet. And I can tell you, when you try to look at what people are saying about it, what lawyers and CPAs and CFOs are saying about it, you can find somebody on both sides of the issue, saying that you can pay it and you can't pay it. For example, 2 days ago, I saw that the president of the Guam Bankers Association said definitively you cannot pay bonuses. Now, what kind of clout the president of the Guam Bankers Association has, I don't know, but perhaps the banks in Guam are not going to let you pay bonuses with it. I haven't seen anything else that definitive. And my basic thought is that if you're paying a bonus that is very much in line with what the purpose of it is, for example, hazard pay or some kind of retention bonus for employees that kept coming to work when you couldn't get anyone else to come to work, I think that those kinds of bonuses are probably going to be allowed. I think that if you're talking about bonuses for management or just bonuses to make sure you spent all your PPP money, I would be very hesitant about those types of bonuses.
So be able to support it. I would add to it, don't pay any bonuses to owners. If the owner or the partner is also an employee, please don't go there. Yes, and we've seen a lot of creativity, and we'll get to creativity here in a minute as people search for how they're going to maximize their PPP forgiveness. But at the end of the day, even if you don't get forgiveness, it's still 1% money for 2 years, which is not a bad deal either. Let's go into another component of forgiveness, and that is the famous full-time equivalent definition. One of the things I found interesting is that you get to choose your comparative time period. We heard that you can choose either your full-time equivalents from February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, or from January 1st, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. Is that correct?
That is literally what the statute says. That is straight out of the statute, that it is up to the employer to decide. So yes.
Okay. I see that there's a question out there, and I'm going to get to the question here once we get through the FTEs. What if I reduced my salary to an employee? Is that, if the employee's salary was below 100,000 and I took them down to 75, does that impact my FTE calculation?
So it doesn't impact your FTE calculation, but it possibly impacts the dollar amount that you're going to be forgiven. You're not supposed to decrease anyone's salary more than 25%. So in your scenario, you're right at 25%.
Yeah.
So I don't think that would be a problem, but if you went a penny more, I think it would be a problem.
Okay. So let's say, I let some people go, and then I got the PPP, and I got the PPP in the second round, right? So, it was touch and go there for a minute. How long do I have and to restore those employees? Do I have to do it?
So that's really kind of a two-part question, right? Because you have two things working there. You have the head count component to the forgiveness, which your head count you're supposed to compare to one of those two time frames we just talked about. And you're supposed to be able to fix that by June 30th. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is how much money you're spending, right? So if you have, if you're down 30% on your staff, you're not going to be able to spend that much payroll that you need, the payroll dollars you need to spend in order to get forgiveness, right? Because your PPP loan was based on 2.5 times your average monthly payroll. Right. And you have 8 weeks to spend it. And so if you don't have enough staff to pay out at least 75% of your loan and payroll, then you're not going to be able to meet that requirement of the forgiveness piece.
Boy, they're going to get you one way or the other, aren't they? So what if I'm trying to be in the spirit of what, Congress wants us to do to stabilize employment in the U.S. And so I go back, I get the PPP again, second round, and I call all my employees and say, please come back.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to.
So what you need to do is then you need to send them a letter. You could do it in an email if you want, but you need to send them a letter making them a job offer, giving them a deadline by which to respond. It could be whatever deadline you want that you think is reasonable. And you need to tell them that you're offering them a job and tell them they need to either accept or decline in writing. And if you have an employee that declines in writing, it is in theory not supposed to count against your FTE or head count. That is what the FAQs that the SBA has put out say. And so you're supposed to have a comfort level with that right now. They've said they're not going to change that in the final regs.
So let me get that, because that's a little controversial, the last thing that you just said.
Okay.
So if I invite my employees to come back and they say no, and I get it in writing,
Mm-hmm.
then I don't get penalized on the forgiveness?
You don't get penalized on your head count on forgiveness. You're still going to have to spend that money, 75% on payroll. So I don't know how the SBA thinks that that's going to help you necessarily.
Because you're going to get penalized here, you're going to get penalized there, right?
Right. So if, like, let's say though that you used 75% of your money on payroll anyways, but your head count was off by 1 or 2 because people declined to come back. If you had that in writing, then in theory, I think that would be the perfect situation where you should still get forgiven.
Okay. Well, again, I guess part of what I'm trying to figure out is, I listen to the news and I read up online, and, I come to my conclusion. But at the end of the day, if I can't convince or change the policy of my bank, I'm dead in the water, right?
Maybe. I mean, hopefully those SBA regulations are going to cover all those situations, but they're probably not. You're probably going to have some wiggle room there and interpretations left open to bankers.
Yeah, I like it. Are you referring then to the interim final guidance from the SBA? I like the...
You mean the one that they put out before they distributed PPP loans and then they changed it?
Yes, welcome to our world. So, as we mentioned before, the restoration period is still before June 30th.
That is still the period. It's just a big question mark as to exactly how that's going to work. Because if you're, as you mentioned earlier, if you have, like we got our PPP funding in the middle of April, so we're going to be done with it by the middle of June. What happens if we don't have our head count fixed by the end of June? We don't have an answer to that yet.
Well, there are some creative solutions that I've heard, so I'll throw them out here and see what you think. But before we get to creativity, we do have a question. It says, can you pay sub-S distributions in line with previous years with the PPP? No, you can't do that. Again, the whole PPP thing is geared towards employees. It's geared towards rent. It's geared towards utilities. And they're going to be very mindful of any things that flow through to owners. So I don't recommend that. I do want to take a moment though and talk about some of the oversight that's coming down with the PPP. And I don't know how many people are on the webinar versus Facebook Live, or the size of the PPP money that people got, but everybody over 2 million is going to get reviewed. And what we hear is that they're going to be, if they find that they are not compliant, that they will have to repay it, and obviously they won't get forgiveness. And if they are compliant during that process, that administrative actions won't be sought. So we'll see. Creativity. So I'm not going to meet my FTEs. I'm not going to meet or I'm not going to meet my dollar spend on payroll related things. We've already talked about bonuses. Can I hire my family members?
So I would say maybe if you're going to hire your family members and you're really going to have them doing work and you're going to have them, I would recommend a timesheet would be a good idea. Maybe some little notes about what they're doing. If they're really doing work and you're hiring them at a wage in line with what you're paying other people, I think it's fine. But if you're just going to hire your college kid and pay them and they're never going to do any work, you're running the risk that if you get audited, that you would not have, once you get audited, I would imagine that's going to come way after forgiveness. So you would have that portion unforgiven, I guess, and presumably a penalty, wouldn't you think, Pam?
You know, I don't know. It sounds to me that they're like, okay, if you get caught and then you don't get forgiveness and you repay the loan, then no harm, no foul is what we're hoping. But again, the more creative you're going to be, the less, as you said, the less benefit that's going to the business, the more suspicious it could make them. I know a lot of businesses that have family members at every level of the business, right? So it exists, right? But again, I like your suggestions of timesheets, of documenting the work product and things like that. Another one I've heard is I want to convert my independent contractors to employees. What do you think about that idea?
Ooh, that's a creative one, fraught with some landmines, I think. So first of all, anytime I have somebody who wants to convert a 1099 into a W-2, I always say proceed with caution if you're doing it in the middle of the year, because I think anytime you issue somebody both a 1099 and a W-2 in the same year, that potentially sends up some red flags at the IRS. So I don't like that, and we're currently in the middle of the year. The second thing I would say is if you're converting them from an independent contractor to an employee, were they really always an employee to begin with? And are you essentially admitting that they were an employee to begin with? So you would want to do a little bit more analysis about that. If you are going to give somebody increased job duties, let's say you have somebody who's been doing marketing for you and they really have been an independent contractor, but now you want to bring that person on to be the receptionist and the file clerk and to do marketing, just for example.
How about be the accountant too?
Sure, why not? If you're going to throw a bunch of extra job duties in there and bring them on full time and make them an employee, then that's a whole different scenario because you probably really are bringing on a true employee then.
Okay, well, thanks. A couple other things that COVID-19 HR issues that COVID-19 have amplified for us is unemployment.
Yes. Yes, there have been so many issues with unemployment. Let me say this. First off, employers are supposed to not have their unemployment banks or their unemployment accounts charged back for COVID-related unemployment. Your tax rate isn't supposed to go up as a result of that. I can tell you that in Texas, which is where I am, that I listened to a webinar the TWC did, which is the entity that administers our unemployment in Texas. And a lawyer for TWC said that nobody's tax rate is going to go up as a result of COVID claims. However, we're spending a lot of money and the money has to come from somewhere. So probably what's going to happen is at the end of the year, when we look at tax rates, we're going to adjust all the tax rates across the board. So if the lowest tax rate right now is 2.5%, the lowest tax rate next year might be 3.5%. So you will still be in the lowest tax rate, but it'll be a different tax rate. So take that.
I mean, they're right. You know, we had a guest on you can see the recording on our homepage and our YouTube channel. that was talking about taxes, you know, and how much enforcement is going to go up because with COVID-19, hopefully in the rearview mirror, you can't raise taxes. So you got to get it somewhere. And they're expecting that enforcement is going to go up, which is kind of a scary thing when you talk about PPP's first cousin, the idle, but we're not talking about that today.
You know that when you're talking about enforcement, though, that's another question that I get a lot is my employees been home because I furloughed them or laid them off. They've been getting unemployment due to that. Now I have PPP funds and I want to bring them back. Or now I'm opening again and I want to bring them back. And they don't want to come back. They say that they're just uncomfortable coming back. They're scared. That is not a reason that they can choose to stay home and still collect unemployment. So if that happens, you're supposed to report them to your state unemployment fraud division. And the reason I said that brings up enforcement in my mind is what is your unemployment agency going to do with that information, right? I have a feeling there's a lot of employees in that boat because I've heard it from so many employers right now. So is the unemployment division really going to go investigate all of those people? I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, they could do it 3 years from now. I don't, you know, I've had one before. I've only had it happen one time in 16 years. And it was like two and a half years after the person got unemployment that TWC came back and was doing an investigation on whether they had fraudulently received unemployment.
Are you kidding me? That much later?
Yep.
Well, you know, it's just been such a dramatic shift for us, for employers, right? Because before COVID-19, you know, we took a lot of employees on because, you know, they had a pulse. They showed up every day and could do some basic jobs. You know, and now, you know, so we kind of have that mindset that we don't want to tick off our employees because we need them, right? We need them to do the basic things that our businesses do. And now, you know, we have to turn them in if they don't want to come back. I'm not sure they would want to come back if we went and reported them as non-compliant with unemployment. But I guess, you know, it's got to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
2 years, who knew? Have you guys, another thing that I imagine falls under the employment issues is returning to work, and what are the requirements that employers have to go through to make sure the workplace is safe? Last night I had to go. I got my hair done just to be on camera with you, and I had to wear this lovely mask, right? Even with, you know, Cathedral Capital logos the whole time. And, you know, they were spraying down stuff and all of this. You know, some people are saying they have to redo their employee handbooks now. And, you know, it's just all overwhelming. What have you heard, or what have you seen, or what are you recommending on the front of making the workplace safe?
So I have a lot of different clients opening a lot of different kinds of businesses. And so the first thing is it's going to depend on the kind of business you have and how many people you're having in and out of your business. So if you're reopening an office that has 5 or 6 people in, you know, 4,500 square feet, that's a little different than if you're opening a gym. That's, you know, then see, you have to think about first, what is the kind of business that you have and how many people are going to be in it on a daily basis. You need to definitely think about, do you want to, you just have employees in your building all the time, or you have employees and customers? Because there's those might be 2 different standards that you want to think about. If you're having just employees and you have a small office, you're probably going to do things a lot differently than if you have a gym and you're going to have customers in all the time. So you first want to think about that. You want to go and think about how much do you need to think about managing social distancing, spacing between customers as they come in? Do you need to think about, do you want to take temperatures when people come into your facility? You know, it's really more of a loaded question, Pam, than we can really dive into in this 1 hour discussion that we have, because it's so dependent on the kind of business that you have and what's right for your business. But you can take your employees' temperature, you can take your customers' temperature. The biggest thing that I've seen coming up in the last couple of days is, can you require your employees to wear masks? Does that violate their rights in some way? I would say in Texas, you probably can require your employees to wear masks. I haven't heard a lot of legal arguments on the other side of it yet, but I'm sure there's going to be creative legal arguments on the other side of that one too.
Oh, I'm sure. But in terms of, the question is this temporary or not, right? And we have a question in the Q&A box here. It says, what if you bring these employees back and business is still bad in July, right? So we've gotten through the June 30th, then we lay them off again.
I think you have to. I mean, you still have to make the decision that's right for your business. And if you can't afford your employees, you can't afford your employees.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate. And I guess that's one of the things I heard, a couple of things I've heard on some of the webinars we've been to is people are changing their employee handbooks because of COVID-19.
I think that you really want to think carefully about changing your employee handbook permanently because of COVID-19. I've had some clients change a couple of policies in their handbook. And so far what we've done with that is we have done temporary changes. A vacation policy, for example, I changed one the other day for a client who typically pays out vacation at the end of the year. And right now it's all they can do to afford to keep employees on payroll, let alone pay that out. So they've made they've changed that for this year to they're not going to pay it out at the end of the year. But we did that as a temporary change that we sent out to all the staff and had the staff sign acknowledging it. So you definitely want to think about whether you're just being reactive and whether this is a permanent change you would want to have, or if it's something that's temporary. I wouldn't go redoing your entire handbook at this point.
Okay. Because I could see people getting creative with their handbooks about not only making people wear face masks, but the type of face mask, the colors of face mask. I mean, that's the beauty of employment law, right? As much as we've had dress codes, right? Now we're going to have face mask policies.
Right? You could, I'm sure.
Oh my goodness. So another thing that's come up is ADA, Americans with Disability Act issues. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so I'm seeing employers needing to really keep their ears open for ADA issues right now. If you have an employee that doesn't want to come back to work and they just say they're scared, that's one thing. That's not protected at all. But if you have an employee who says, look, I have an autoimmune disorder and so I don't want to come back to work because I am at higher risk, then you need to consider that as a request for an accommodation, and you need to have an interactive dialogue with that person about whether they have a disability that you need to accommodate. Now, ADA only covers if you have 15 employees or more, so not everyone is covered by that, but a lot of employers fall into that ADA category. And I would say too that it used to be that a lot of employers took the position that it was not reasonable to allow employees to work from home and or it worked a financial hardship on the business. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see that that's absolutely turned on its head right now because so many people have been working from home. How are you going to say that it works a hardship on your company to have someone working at home who's been doing it for the last 2 months?
Right. Okay. So I guess just a shout out here as we go through some of the final conclusions. If anybody else has any other questions or things in the chat, I'm going to go over here real quick and see what we're seeing on Facebook and seeing what if we're having any posts or anything there. But you know, I think one of the hallmarks of COVID-19 has been it's as clear as mud and it will change tomorrow. And that's been one of the hardest things in your line of work and my line of work, is people look at us to be authorities and to guide them through these rough waters. And it's been exceptionally hard for us to do that, because we read the law and then we see, this bank or that bank or another bank treating it differently. And so I think one of the things that has come through again and again and again is just, this will not be consistently applied. So if you're talking to somebody and they say, well, I included that, or I did head count, I didn't do FTEs, they could be right. Mm-hmm. Right. And if their bank accepted it, then that's good for them. And, if your bank doesn't accept it, I don't think you're going to be able to convince banks to change their policy. I've seen some of the forgiveness stuff come in, and a lot of the support be exceptionally complicated. And then I listen to you and your banker, and it's exceptionally straightforward. I think that, like you said, a lot of businesses have been affected differently. We all went in this, preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And we don't know, it could be worse in July, but as you go through this, any summary comments or tips or tricks that you want to put forth?
I do want to say that, obviously I don't know all bankers or all banks. And I would say though, that if your bank says something at first with regard to forgiveness that you think is contrary to a regulation or some guidance that you've seen out there, I wouldn't just throw my hands up. I would at least try. I would give the bank the guidance and at least try to explain it to them. I'll tell you that my bank almost made a mistake in my favor doing the PPP loan, because they almost included 401k for the partners on the loan amount, which, yes, I would have gotten more money out of it, but then it wasn't right. And so I pointed it out to them and they went back and checked. And so I would just say, just because your bank tells you no at first, if you really think you're right and you can put your hands on some guidance, it's possible that you might be able to change your bank's mind. The bigger your bank, the less likely you are to change their mind, though, probably.
Well, that's good. That's good. I like a good hopeful endorsement there. So, again, we went through this, and there's things we know, there's things we don't know. You have 8 weeks from the time you got the money to spend the money, 75% on, at least 75% on payroll. You have to maintain your employment levels. And that could be calculated on FTEs. Some people read it as head count. And the law says you have until June 30th to look at that, comparing it to one of 2 periods. And then you have to produce the paperwork that you basically gave them to get it in the first place. You have to produce that plus receipts for the other expenses.
Pam, what about if you got your PPP loan on April 15th and you paid payroll on April 14th, and you're not going to have enough payroll cycles before the 8 weeks is up to use all your money? Any idea how the banks might look at that?
I'm conservative, and I'm going to say if you change your policies on anything during this time, you're probably asking for scrutiny. I think it's the luck of the draw. If you're off by 1 day, most of the people that I have looked at can get 8 weeks worth of payroll in that period. But much like, can you be creative with your payroll dates? Can you be creative in other areas? If there's something that draws their attention and they look a little closer and you look like you might have manipulated it, I think you just have to sit with yourself and say, is it right? Can you defend it? Or does it sound like you're manipulating it and it might draw undue attention and risk all of this forgiveness being, all of it not being forgiven, as opposed to a week or two of payroll? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how would all of it not be forgiven? Like, let's say you really.
Well, no, I'm saying, let's say that you only got 7 weekly payrolls in there.
Oh, okay.
And then you said, well, that's not right. I should get 8 in. And so you changed the payroll date on the last payroll to get 8 payrolls in, right? You're risking 1 week's worth of payroll that you moved in, but you're putting 7 weeks at risk of forgiveness. So you have to weigh your risks, right? Is the value of that last payroll enough to put the whole forgiveness at risk? So, you know, have conversations, seek clarity where you can with the banks. You know, they might have different opinions from what you and I have had. Some of the banks, you know, some people are comfortable with ask for forgiveness instead of asking for forgiveness, pray for. Instead of asking for permission, pray for forgiveness. That's what I was trying to go for. You're like holding back, like you knew what I was trying to say there. I'm on the struggle bus. What can I say?
Friday.
Oh my goodness. Is it a Friday? Because I'm going to tell you, I have dealt with so many employee issues today that impact the finances of my clients that, you know, I'm ready for beer 30. I don't know about you, right? You're a wine drinker. So any other parting comments, any other questions coming up from the audience?
I would just say that I've heard so many clients sweat the details of, am I going to get all of this forgiven? And, you know, if you don't get 10 or 20% forgiven, take a deep breath. It's 1% interest for 2 years, you know, or pay it back. You know, you have some options there. So yes, would you love to get 100% forgiven? Absolutely. That is everybody's goal. But if you can't get 100% forgiven, do your best. Don't push the line too much into something that's going to get you in trouble, and just send the money back or pay it back over 2 years.
Right. Yeah. And you and I kind of talked a little bit about that as we were preparing for this, is that so much attention is being paid on this program, but this program is not going to make somebody's business, right? There are so many other underlying business issues that need to be addressed. And so if you find yourself spending too much money, like you said, take a breath and figure out what's the problem that you need to fix in your business today. Mm-hmm. And it might not be PPP.
Right. Well, I just want to say thanks to everybody for joining us today. I see Tina Fox, who asked one of our questions, went to law school with me, and she has a law firm in the mid-cities that does estate planning. And I didn't even know when she asked that question, sub-S distributions, that's like way above my head. So I'm glad you knew the answer to that, Pam.
And I'll just throw it out there that if anybody listening knows of anybody who's struggling with issues, you know, I know that you are happy to take, you know, calls or consult with people. We at CathCap as well. You know, CathCap's email, you can contact me, Pam at CathCap. Our owner, Brooke, with an E, at CathCap is also, you know, happy to take offline questions that perhaps might be more unique and dealt with on a one-on-one scenario. And I know, Caroline, if you want to throw out your email address, I know you're open to that as well.
Sure. It's Harrison at Pham, Pham Harrison.com. And we are, I'm on LinkedIn. You can message me on LinkedIn. We're all working from home, but my office phone is ringing to my cell phone these days. So keeping office hours is even more important than it used to be.
Right, right. Well, hopefully we'll all be back in our offices and we won't have to have, a webinar dealing with, I think of all the new words that we have now, thanks to COVID-19. I think, who knew what a 940 or a 941 was, right? And,
I knew.
okay, but you're a little bit of a, yeah.
Okay.
You're an A student.
Well, it's because it's a payroll type form.
Okay, well, yes, you have other reasons to worry about that, but most people didn't know those words, and they've come up the learning curve, and yeah, we're having big fun and educating people, and there's plenty of things, if we ever do return to socializing together as professionals, there's plenty of things that we can drink to. But I so appreciate your expertise in this and your guidance and your level-headed guidance and the perspective that you're able to take during these really challenging times where not only are people worried about, how are they going to take care of their employees, but, what is their business model going to look like after COVID-19? We've seen a lot of people pivot, some pivot successfully and some not. But it is truly an exceptional time to be either in your business or in ours. And we're very grateful for you, for all you do for your local community, but now opening yourselves up for our greater community, which stretches across the U.S. So thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Pam. It's been a pleasure.
Take
Hope
care.
everyone has a lovely weekend.
Yes.